Now let's start with this. Okay, so what do I want to do first? Put the B lever in. That goes there to get it spring tucked into the case, and the shoulder screw. Now typically you don't need to be doing anything clever in the way of lubrication. It's not a wheel bearing or something, it'll run just nicely as it is. Check that moves freely. Nip that up, check it still moves freely. That's good. Don't over tighten it, you'll only end up making a mess of it. The catch that holds the shutter cocked, let's get this in position. This is always awkward to get in place. You've got to get that shaft, that little bush there, into the hole in the mechanism plate, and that falls right on a recess, so it doesn't want to go in square. But you need to make sure it does go in square, otherwise that won't do up, the screw won't do up properly, or the lever will end up sitting cockeyed and it might get damaged. So a single fixing screw. It certainly moves. It's probably not as free as I'd like. There may be some friction between the spring there where it rubs against the case, so I'm just going to run a wipe of molybdenum paste down that little groove under the spring. And see if that improves things. Yeah, that seems a little bit snappier. Right, the 500th of a second speed, the high speed spring. It's here. I'll just put a wipe through there. Put that over its post. That should be down underneath that B lever. And the sprung loaded lever, this is the return spring for our shutter release. We've got to get that in there on its post, under the spring, over this lever, on that post, and the spring tucked down inside the case. So it's only marginally more awkward than it sounds. It can be achieved. There's a toothpick. I'll start manipulating this into position. Get that on its post. Get the B lever underneath, hold that down, get the spring tucked down into the case. Job done. That's good. The shutter release lever, there's virtually nothing to this. I'm going to put a wipe of molybdenum paste through the pivot and into the two notches. One of those notches is where the return spring acts, and the other one acts on that latch here to release the shutter when it's cocked like that, and that typically blocks the action of the shutter release. If the shutter's not cocked, it sits up there and blocks the action, which saves you film in theory. The main lever, I'm going to run some molybdenum paste around the inside rim, around the outside rim. This piece is called the bird paw, and I'm just wiping some on the tip of that and on the tip here of the lever at the other end. Let's bring this shutter back into the picture. A wipe there and a wipe there. On the retard gear train, on this lever, I'm wiping that with some molybdenum paste. On this lever that moves the pallets, I'm run some on there. That should do, I think. Let's get this main lever in position. Get that spring hooked over its post. Hold back that, swing that out the way. Make sure the B lever is not trapped under anything. Why is that not moving? That's better. Getting everything seated is always tricky. Okay, so it looks like everything's seated there. It's seated, the lever here is pulled back out of the way. This lever's back against the edge. The bird pawl is free. The shutter's not cocked, so this lever is blocking the action of the shutter release, and it's ready to be cocked. So I'm just going to put a bit of molybdenum paste around this, around the centre where it runs around the lens tube, and round the lumps and bumps of the cam there, cam surfaces, and where it picks up the high-speed spring. The high-speed spring picks up here, and of course that has quite a bit of tension to it. Right, let's get this in place. That's down. It should be set to B. Let's see if it goes. That certainly works. What about 1 second? That looks good. Now I note with interest that when I looked at this arm for cocking the shutter, I'm going to move that blind across, so we've got a bit of contrast problem here. When I looked at the arm on that cocking arm there for the shutter, it was bent, but it was probably intentionally bent. That looked fairly positive, and it wasn't dragging on the case. I assumed that was bent and it was dragging on the case, and that was slowing the mechanism up. That appears not to have been the case. Let's get this front on in here. Rotate that into position. And I'll use the tip of my tweezers to rotate that latch in position. Right, so now I can see my alignment mark. What's a tenth of a second look like? Yeah, credible. 25th? Yep. Those speeds sound good to me. I'll test them, but they sound pretty credible. What's 1 second like? Good. Bit slow in the last half. That could be down to the tension of the spring. Now I think they'll be fine. Alright. I think that shutter's great just as it is. And I'll put the nameplate back on there. All of these parts, if I'd failed to mention it, I'd have had off and I've cleaned with Naphtha typically. And the main problem, if you could say there was a main problem, was the old lubricant, the old grease. It was pretty sticky. Just check that that doesn't foul anything. We can move through our entire speed range, including the 500th, and cock that. With the 500th of a second speed, that engages the second spring. There's always quite a pronounced lump to select the 500th, and then you cock the shutter. You do not cock the shutter and then select the 500th. If you have selected the 500th and you have cocked the shutter and then you decide to change your mind and use another speed, that's not a problem. You can go downhill. That'll drop it down to a 250th, okay. But going back the other way, cocking the shutter and then trying to force it to a 500th, don't do that. Okay, well that's looking good. Now, I have cleaned up the lenses. There was a bit of, quite a smear on the inside surface of that rear group. The front group, the front surface is not marvellous. It looks a lot better now than it did, but it's not in stunning condition. I had to dismantle that so I could clean the inside surface of that front glass, and there was a little bit of haze on that, and that cleaned away nicely. When I look at this now, that lens looks quite good. Remember, this is an uncoated lens, but if you look at it under high magnification, the front surface is quite marked. It's had a hard life. With this type of lens, it's not at all uncommon for there to be some internal haze. There may be haze on the rear surface of the front glass. And what often happens is that people look at their lens and it looks a little bit hazy, and they clean the front surface because that's what they can get to, thinking the haze is on that. And they just clean it and clean it and clean it, and it doesn't matter how much they clean it, they've still got haze. But of course, by the time they've cleaned it 1,000 times, they probably scuffed the front surface too. So it's people trying to clean haze on the wrong surface is often gets people into trouble. Well, that shutter looks good. Let me put that release lever back in place. It's always tricky remembering which way up this goes. Where are we? That way. So it must go that way. And the screw goes in from behind the shutter, so it makes this is all awkward to take apart. If you could get at the screw from the front, it would be much easier when you were disassembling or reassembling things, but that's not the way they were made. There we go. And of course the other screw, that holds this to the release arm in the camera body. And here's our retainer ring, which is all nicely cleaned now. It's in good condition, runs on smoothly, no problems there. So at least the shutter is ready to go back in the camera body. And I've got to deal with this camera body next. Now, reading my riding instructions, the owner is not expecting or particularly wanting the cosmetic condition of this camera to be in any way improved. The broken leather on the front here, I'm going to have to remove that and glue that back very carefully. It's broken away. There's some glue there, someone's glued that back or attempted to, but it doesn't look particularly good, so I'm going to remove all that and then put it back again, hopefully glue that down and do a better job so that is not fragmenting. Apart from that, I think it'll just be a fairly simple service, but then I've said that a few times before. From the top, we'll start with the rewind. Something through the fork of the rewind rotate that anti-clockwise, the knob should come off. You pop that shaft out of there, and the bush we can remove. Two blanking screws here. That's where an accessory shoe could have been mounted. I'm not sure if any of the Type 010s came with an accessory shoe, and there's just a chrome plate. The advance knob. You need a spanner that you use on the flats on the top of that shaft there. And if you don't put the spanner on there, you'll end up in strife. So the spanner's on there stopping the shaft from turning. If I rotate this clockwise, it should unscrew. Of course it doesn't want to come loose, so I'm going to have to put a hose clamp on there so I can get a good grip of it. As you can see, I've got a hose clamp on that knob, and I've got a bit of rubber on the inside of it so it grips that knob well. I've got my spanner on the shaft, and if I rotate this clockwise, that came loose straight away. But there was no way I could get a grip on that knob with my fingers well enough to shift that. So that's off. The button on the top of the shutter release needs to come off. Now there's a couple of ways of approaching this. I've got a pair of crimp lug pliers here. You'll see the rounded jaws. If you put a bit of rubber on there, that'll probably grab that well enough that you can unscrew it. No damage to the button. That's a good way to do it. Another tool I've got is this one that I use for the rewind buttons for the later Retinas. That'll do the job too. Again, with a bit of rubber helps. Grab that and unscrew it. So carrying on with this top cover, I've got two screws here. That'll lift off. The finder stays inside the top cover. We'll pull that apart and clean that shortly. There's not an awful lot to this. Let's have a close look. Here's our frame counter. It's got a spring, and this is two pieces. They're quite tight on there. That's tighter than it needs to be. There's some slippage there so that you can adjust your frame counter. Put those to one side. There's a bush there on the top of the film advance. The relieved part goes down because it goes in the centre of our rewind lever. The shutter release will probably lift out that shaft. Don't start twiddling with this, it's probably been adjusted to the correct length. Let's have a look at this mechanism. I want the screw out from here. That's probably tight. It's sprung loaded, so we'll lift out the screw. There's this lever, a washer, spacer washer, large hole. This arm, spacer washer, small hole, and you're down to the top plate. We've got two springs, one here and one here. I'm going to remove the screws that hold them in place. The springs look vaguely similar. Sometimes they look more similar than that. They're not the same. Take great note of how they were, which spring went where. This gear comes off, that should unscrew. This gear cluster should come off that shaft. It's probably reluctant. I'm just going to get a couple of screwdrivers and lever under that gently, and it should come off. If I can find the appropriate screwdrivers, that'll do. Three screws hold the bush here for the Film Advance shaft. And that'll lift off. That's just a slip fit. You'll probably find it's full of rubbish and that'll need to be cleaned and lubricated when we put it back together. In the back of the camera, the take-up spool can be lifted out. That's a Bakelite plastic. Make sure it's not broken and take care not to break it when you're putting everything back together. That's virtually all the Film Advance components out we need to take out. If this is stiff and doesn't revolve smoothly, you can take this apart. Now what you've got here is a tiny screw down inside this roller, a tiny screw in the sprocket here. Those screws need to be probably pretty much removed completely. Then you can slide the shaft with its gear straight out the top. There's a washer in here between this sprocket and the top of the camera. So that's where that washer goes if you're looking for it. And the sprocket goes that way up. The teeth are down low. They're down almost in line with that rail there. So that's our Film Advance as far as we need to go. I want the struts and everything out of this camera, so to get at the screw, hinge screw and things here, I want that leather off. So we've got chrome, this is our depth of field scale. This camera, by the way, was made for the English speaking market, so all the stuff has got English words on it. And the focus scale is marked in feet. If it had been made for the German market, that would be in German. The focus scale would of course been metric. So I want this leather off. The leather is quite dry and fragile. Hopefully the glue is even drier and more fragile, and this will come off without too much of a fight. Don't just peel leather back if it looks fragile. You're likely to end up tearing it. If the leather was in good condition, if it was supple and looked fairly supple, then yes, you can certainly do that. But this doesn't. This looks a bit brittle. It may be an illusion. It may be that the finish on the leather is the brittle part that I'm looking at here. You might have like a lacquer finish. one of the screws holding the struts in is back at about this position, so I've got to get the leather up at least to that position, but preferably off altogether. And the last thing you want to do with brittle leather is pull it up and fold it over. You'll end up with a crease across it, and if it doesn't snap, you'll still have an ugly crease that'll be very, very obvious. It's got quite a thick layer of glue. It looks a bit lumpy, and it's probably a bit it's irregular. Some of it's probably glued down very well. Some of it's probably not glued down much at all. It's a tough patch right there. You can also strike problems if the leather has come loose at some stage and some bright spark has decided to glue it back on and squirt it in something that's very tenacious. I mean, people will use anything. I'm doing my best here to keep my scalpel blade scraping against the aluminium body, not filleting the leather. That's it, it's off. Okay, you can see the state of this. You can see the glue's quite thick. It's very well glued to the leather in a lot of places. Other places it wasn't glued very well at all. There's a very shiny brittle part there. Now that was certainly an extra layer of glue that's come from somewhere. Someone may have had this up in order to get at the tripod socket if the tripod socket was loose. It's not uncommon for the screws to be loose. I'm going to remove that and clean that and put that back. The screws are not loose in this case. They're good and tight. And here's the screw, the lowest screw for the struts. Under here is our hinge pin screw. So I want the door off next, so I'm going to have a go at the hinge pin screws. Now, is this door sprung loaded? Yes, it is. The front door on this camera is sprung loaded at the hinge, which makes it a bit more awkward to deal with. Now, to get that spring up out of the body without scratching everything, I'm just going to put my rule down there between the spring and the body. It should be down here. And then I can lift that forward. It should lift out of the body. Yeah, it's coming. There we go. If I stretch that up, I can get that out off the front standard. That's got extra deep pins by the looks of it. Normally they don't engage as strongly as that. That's it. You need one side off. So there's our door off, and I've got to deal with the leather on that because that's pretty rough. Our focus helical here is gummy with dried grease. I need to make an alignment mark so that I know where it goes back on the outer helical. The inner helical sticks up quite proud here, so I can't just run my rule across and scribe that. I'm just going to put a scribe lines, 2 scribe lines there. Four screws hold the focus scale to the outer helical. So here we've got 4 screws hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. They're the black screws. And the bellows should drop back into the body. They do with a bit of encouragement. There are 4 large screws here that hold the focus mount complete to the front standard here. Two of those screws were loose, which would have meant that the front standard wasn't being held rigid. Here's the focus mount. We have got 6 screws holding the retainer in place. And if you're taking something like this apart, lay the parts out carefully so that you know where everything came from. I'm not doing that. Okay, so there's the front standard. I'll just recover those screws that went through it to hold the bellows in place. I was just saying that the 4 screws here hold the bellows in place. I've just recovered those. Now the camera stopped then because I was running a contest to see who would win first, the flat battery or the file size limit. And it was the file size limit that stopped the camera at that point. Right, so with the front surfaces of the inner and outer helical on the same plane, I'll continue my 2 scratch marks across there. So now I know where the inner and outer helical are to be assembled together. This is exceptionally gummy. What have we got left here? The struts, of course. Screw here. And one here. That one's fairly well stuck. That might need a drop of solvent and it might need a little bit of hammer attention.